Settle in, if you can, beside the imagined sound of a fire. There is no need to hold the day together now. Its messages, errands, explanations, small alarms, and unfinished conversations can wait outside the room for a little while. The fire does not settle them. It does not offer a theory of them. It simply burns with a patient indifference, turning wood into warmth and light, making a small circle in the dark where one can be still. Tonight we are going to keep company with Arthur Schopenhauer. He is often introduced as a severe philosopher, even a gloomy one. There is some truth in that. He looks steadily at frustration, disappointment, illness, aging, and the strange fact that getting what we want so often leaves us wanting again. But his philosophy is not only a catalogue of sadness, it is an attempt to ask why restlessness has such power over us, and whether there are moments in which its grip grows lighter. Those moments might be found in art, in music, in compassion, in the sight of a landscape, in a room becoming quiet, or in the simple act of noticing a desire without immediately obeying it. They may not solve the whole of life. They do not have to. For Schopenhauer, a temporary release from the usual pressure of wanting was already something rare and important. A window opened for a moment in a crowded house. You do not need to agree with him tonight. You do not need to follow every turn. The ideas may arrive clearly, or they may become part of the background, like the shifting light on a wall. We will move slowly through a life of ports, books, arguments, winter streets, long walks, and late recognition. We will move through a philosophy that begins with a surprising suggestion. The world we know is never simply the world by itself. It is always the world as it appears to someone. That thought need not make the room uncertain. It can make it intimate. There is the fire as it appears now, orange at the center, darker at the edges, a sound that seems near and then recedes. There is the weight of the body beneath the blankets. There is a thought passing through the mind, perhaps the thought that sleep would be welcome. These things are not less real because they arrive in experience. They are simply given to us through experience. Schopenhauer will ask what follows from that fact. For the moment, let us begin much earlier, before the books and the famous sentences. With a child born beside the Baltic Sea. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Danzig, the port city now called Gdansk. It was a place shaped by trade, weather, movement, and the broad gray water of the north. Ships came and went. Goods passed through warehouses. Money was counted, letters were sent, and distant events mattered because they could alter the price of a cargo or the safety of a route. His father, Heinrich Flores Schopenhauer, was a merchant and shipowner who expected his son to enter the commercial world. There is something useful in beginning there. Before Arthur became a philosopher of restless striving, he grew up close to the ordinary machinery of striving. Buying, selling, calculating, traveling, worrying over risk, hoping for gain. Trade is not a foolish enterprise. It is one of the ways people feed families, build towns, and connect distant lives. Yet it also displays, almost in plain view, the movement that would preoccupy him. One shipment arrives, and another must be arranged. One account is settled, and another opens. The work has no natural final resting place. Perhaps no child in a merchant family thinks in quite those terms. A child sees doors opening, adults speaking quickly, trunks being packed, maps unrolled on a table. He feels the atmosphere before he understands the business. In Arthur's case, there was travel as well. His family spent time in England and France. The young man heard languages, saw other cities, and learned that a familiar world is only one arrangement among many. That is not yet philosophy, but it can prepare the ground for it. The world feels solid when it is the only world one has known. A street, a church, a schoolroom, a family habit. Each can seem almost necessary. Travel quietly teaches another lesson. Things could be otherwise. Other people wake under other roofs, speak differently, make different assumptions, and still call their surroundings ordinary. The thought is not frightening. It can be liberating. It loosens the knot between what is familiar and what is inevitable. Schopenhauer's own childhood was not an uncomplicated refuge. His mother, Johanna, was intelligent, sociable, and later became a successful writer. His father was serious, ambitious, and prone to darkness of mood. Family stories can become too neat when told backwards, as though every early difficulty must already contain a future philosophy. It is better to be modest. A difficult home does not explain a system of thought. Still, it gives us a human setting, the child watching adults carry hopes and disappointments that he cannot yet name. In 1805, when Arthur was 17, his father died. The circumstances were tragic and have often been understood as suicide. A death of that kind leaves no simple lesson. It does not turn a young person automatically toward wisdom. It can leave questions without answers, or a silence that later thoughts circle without quite entering. For Arthur, the path expected by his father now became less binding. He began to move away from commerce and toward study. This movement was not a sudden escape from ordinary life into a cloud of ideas. It was a change of discipline. A merchant learns to attend to prices, schedules, contracts, and consequences. A student of philosophy learns to attend to arguments, distinctions, assumptions, and consequences of another kind. Both ask what follows from what. Both try, in their own way, to find order in a world that is always partly beyond control. Imagine for a moment the young Schopenhauer in a room after a day of study. The city outside is quieter. A candle burns close to the page. A sentence has been read once, then twice. It does not yet yield its meaning. This is a small and ordinary scene, but philosophy begins in scenes like this. Not in grand pronouncements usually, but in the decision to stay with a question a little longer than convenience would require. The question might be as simple as this: what is it exactly that I know when I know the world? It sounds almost too simple. We all know tables, streets, faces, rain, pain, and the sound of fire. But the more patiently one asks, the less obvious the answer becomes. Do we know things as they are without us? Or do we know them as they appear through the senses, arranged by the mind's own ways of receiving and understanding? These questions had been sharpened before Schopenhauer arrived. The great figure behind him was Immanuel Kant, who had argued that human knowledge does not merely receive a finished world like a mirror receiving a reflection. The mind contributes forms and structures, space, time, causation, the basic order through which experience becomes intelligible. Kant did not mean that people invent the world at whim. He meant that the world we experience is always a world already encountered through the conditions of human knowing. Schopenhauer read Kant with the feeling of someone who has found a difficult but decisive map. He would later say that reading Kant was among the most important events in his intellectual life. Yet he did not become merely a follower. He wanted to simplify, sharpen, and extend what he took to be Kant's central insight. The world is given to us as representation. It is the world as presented to a subject, the world that appears to someone who sees, hears, remembers, compares, and thinks. The word representation can sound bloodless at first, as though it belongs in a museum of old philosophy. Let us make it quieter and closer. You are lying in a room. There may be darkness beyond the curtains, a faint changing glow, the pressure of a pillow, the warmth of the body. None of this arrives in a bare, unshaped heap. It arrives as near and far, before and after, warm and cool, inside and outside, cause and effect. The room is already organized in experience. If a log shifts in the fire, you hear a crack and suppose that heat, wood, and weight have done something. If the sound comes again, you recognize it as a sound of the same kind. Memory joins the present. If you close your eyes, the room does not become nothing. It becomes a different field of sensation and imagination. The world you know is not less real for being known in this way. But it is inseparable from the forms through which it can be known. Schopenhauer expressed this point in a famous, austere sentence: "The world is my representation." At first hearing, it can sound selfish, as though he means that only his own mind exists. He does not mean that. He is not saying that other people are decorations inside Arthur Schopenhauer's private dream. He is saying that every experienced object, for every subject, is encountered as an object for a subject. A mountain, a cup, a moon, a friend, a page of writing. Each is given within the relation of knower and known. There is a calming side to this. So much of our anxiety comes from imagining a world that stands wholly over against us, vast and unapproachable, a hard thing that must be conquered before we can rest. Schopenhauer's thought does not make the world smaller, but it reminds us that the world we inhabit is always the world as lived. It is filtered through attention. It changes when attention changes. A worry at 2 in the morning may appear absolute. In the morning, the same facts may be present, and the world may feel differently arranged. This is not a denial of problems. It is an invitation to notice the difference between a fact and the whole atmosphere that gathers around a fact. The mind is not a neutral window. It is an active condition of appearance. In waking life, we rarely need to say this out loud. We simply live it. We look, judge, fear, hope, return, and revise. Philosophy makes the familiar visible by asking what must already be happening for experience to be possible at all. Schopenhauer studied first at Göttingen, then in Berlin. In Göttingen, he was encouraged toward philosophy and read both Plato and Kant. Plato offered one kind of invitation, to look beyond shifting appearances toward patterns that make thought possible. Kant offered another, to examine the limits and forms of human knowledge itself. These were not identical paths, but Schopenhauer found in them a shared seriousness. The visible world was not the whole story, and the first appearance of things might not be their deepest truth. Berlin, meanwhile, was full of intellectual rivalry. It was a place of lectures, reputations, arguments, and students moving between rooms with notebooks under their arms. Schopenhauer attended lectures by leading figures of the day, among them Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Friedrich Schleiermacher. He did not admire all that he heard. He had a sharp tongue, and he would become especially hostile to the fashionable philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. It is tempting to make this rivalry the whole drama. Hegel filled lecture halls. Schopenhauer found him inflated and obscure. Schopenhauer later scheduled his own lectures at the same hour as Hegel's and attracted very few students. The story is memorable because it is humanly comic. A man with a large opinion of his own ideas sets himself against the celebrated professor and discovers that the crowd has gone elsewhere. But the quieter point is more useful. Philosophical life, like every life, can be caught by comparison. Who is noticed? Who is quoted? Who receives a room full of listeners? Schopenhauer's philosophy of desire did not prevent him from desiring recognition. It is one of the reasons to read him as a person rather than a statue. He understood the pressure of wanting, partly because he felt it. For the listener at night, this can be a gentle reminder. Insight does not make one exempt from the human condition. Knowing that praise is unstable does not make praise meaningless. Knowing that success does not settle the self does not make failure painless. Philosophy is not a magic elevation above life. At its best, it is a way of seeing life more honestly, including the places where one has not yet learned to be free. In 1813, Schopenhauer completed a dissertation on what he called the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. The title sounds formidable. The question beneath it is less forbidding. When we ask why something is so, what sort of answer are we looking for? A physical event may have a cause. A logical conclusion may follow from grounds. A mathematical truth may depend on a proof. An action may arise from a motive. These are all ways in which things can be connected and explained, but they are not quite the same. The principle of sufficient reason names our ordinary expectation that nothing simply appears without some intelligible relation. We ask what caused the sound, what supports the claim, what explains the number, what moved the person to act. The mind seeks a reason. It finds the world navigable partly by finding these threads. Without them, experience would be a shower of disconnected flashes. Schopenhauer's point was not that every question has an answer available to us, nor was it that explanation can reach beyond every limit. It was that the world of representation is a world ordered by relations of this kind. Events appear as caused, judgments appear as grounded. The principle is not merely a habit of asking questions. It belongs to the way the world shows itself to understanding. There is a small comfort in this, even on a sleepless night. The mind can become exhausted by trying to explain every feeling at once. Schopenhauer does not ask us to do that. He asks us to notice that explanation has its own domain. A noise in the house may have a cause. A sadness may have a history. A thought may have been prompted by a memory. But not every moment has to become a case to be solved. The mind's capacity for reasons is real, and it is also not the only way to be alive. The path from this early dissertation to his major work was already opening. He had begun to see that explanation, however useful, tells us about relations within the world as it appears. It tells us what follows from what. It does not yet tell us what the world is in its deepest inward character. That further question would lead him away from the orderly surface of causes and motives and toward the stranger word at the center of his philosophy: will. For now, the fire continues. The room does not require an answer. The body breathes without a theory of breathing. A thought comes and another thought goes. Somewhere outside, rain may be falling on a street, or wind may be moving through a tree. The world as representation is not a prison. It is the field in which all of this appears. The fire, the dark, the body, the gentle movement of attention. We can rest there for a moment before we go further. To go further, Schopenhauer makes a move that is both simple and strange. If the world of representation is the world as it appears to a knowing subject, then perhaps we should ask whether there is any place where we encounter ourselves in another way. Not merely as an object seen from outside, not merely as a body among bodies, but from within. The body becomes his clue. Each of us can look at a hand and see an object in space. It has shape, color, weight, and location. A doctor may describe its bones, tendons, circulation, nerves, and range of movement. A painter may see light lying across the knuckles. A stranger may see only a hand resting on a table. All of these are ways in which the hand is represented. They belong to the visible, measurable world. But when you move your own hand, something else is present. You do not merely observe an event and infer that an inner cause must have occurred. You know the movement in the act of willing it. This does not mean every movement is fully chosen. The body also startles, aches, grows tired, flinches, sleeps. Yet the ordinary experience of acting has a double aspect. From outside there is a body moving. From inside there is an urge, an intention, a push toward motion. Schopenhauer thought this double aspect opened a door. Here, he believed, we encounter the thing that lies beneath representation, not as a picture, but more directly. He called it will. He did not mean merely the conscious resolve by which a person decides to write a letter, make tea, or leave a job. He meant a deeper striving, appetite, impulse, effort, the blind tendency of life to continue, seek, avoid, grow, reproduce, compete, cling, and begin again. It can make plans and give reasons, but it is not created by reasons. A person may explain why she wants a particular thing: security, love, recognition, comfort, achievement. The explanation can be sincere and important. Still, beneath the particular reason, there is often a more basic movement, the condition of reaching outward towards something not yet possessed. Think of thirst. It is not a philosophical argument. The body becomes uneasy, attention narrows, water acquires a particular brightness of meaning. Or think of hunger, fatigue, sexual desire, fear, the wish to be chosen, the wish to be left alone, the wish to know what someone thinks of you. These are not all the same, and they should not be flattened into one mood. Schopenhauer's claim is that they show a common form. They are forms of striving. They make the present incomplete by pointing beyond it. This is why his philosophy can feel so close to the experience of lying awake. The room is quiet, but the will is rarely quiet merely because the lights are out. It continues to arrange tomorrow, replay yesterday, seek reassurance, imagine a better answer, resist an unwanted feeling, demand relief. The mind may be tired while the machinery of wanting continues to turn. Schopenhauer does not scold the machinery. He thinks it is older than our personal stories. It is visible in different degrees and forms throughout nature. A plant reaches toward light. A root works through soil. An animal searches for food, avoids danger, guards its young, sleeps and wakes. A river finds a path downhill, not because it has intentions, but because the world is full of forces, pressing, moving, seeking expression. In Schopenhauer's philosophical picture, will is the inward character of this ceaseless display. This is not a scientific hypothesis in the modern sense. It cannot be tested by placing will in a jar or measuring it with an instrument. It is a metaphysical interpretation, an attempt to say what the endless activity of nature is like from the inside, if the human experience of striving gives us a clue. It may be wrong. Many philosophers have thought it is too sweeping, but it is powerful because it takes an ordinary fact seriously. We are not only spectators of the world, we are also beings pulled through it by needs, impulses, and desires. The title of Schopenhauer's major work is The World as Will and Representation. He completed it while living in Dresden, and it appeared in 1819. The title is a map of the whole system. On one side is the world as it appears, ordered in space and time, connected by causes, presented to a subject. On the other is the world as will, the striving that Schopenhauer believed we grasp most intimately in our own embodied life, and then recognize by analogy in nature. It is worth pausing over the word analogy. Schopenhauer is not entitled simply to announce that every tree, animal, stone, and storm has the same inward life as a human person. He knows that. His move is more cautious, though still bold. The human body is both an object among objects and a lived center of striving. Perhaps then the forces we see in nature are not alien in kind, but are different expressions of a deeper tendency that appears most clearly in us. There is a risk here. We can make nature sentimental, imagining it as a vast, kindly person. Schopenhauer does almost the opposite. It is prodigal, indifferent, endlessly producing and destroying forms. Life feeds on life. One creature survives by consuming another. A storm breaks a branch without malice. An illness consumes strength without argument. The will is not a benevolent plan. It is not a moral author arranging a happy ending. It is simply striving without final satisfaction. That is the severe side of the philosophy. Yet there is also a kind of release in seeing it. Much personal shame comes from treating every restless desire as evidence of a private defect. Why can I not be content? Why do I worry again after the problem is solved? Why does one achievement immediately expose the next hill? Schopenhauer's answer can be bleak, but it can also remove a little self-accusation. Restlessness is not an individual failure alone. It belongs to the shape of desiring life. The point is not to turn this into a slogan. People suffer for specific reasons. Poverty, grief, violence, exclusion, illness, and loss are not interchangeable with the ordinary incompleteness of wanting. A philosophy that makes everything one thing becomes cruel. Schopenhauer can sometimes speak too generally, as though the metaphysical structure of striving were all that needed saying. We do better to hold both thoughts at once. Suffering has personal histories, and the very capacity to be unsatisfied may be woven deeply into life. When The World as Will and Representation appeared, it did not make Schopenhauer famous. The book was largely ignored. This must have stung. He had written a work he regarded as central, and the world had not gathered around it. The will to be recognized had met the world's usual indifference. The irony is almost too neat. It shows the philosopher inside the same human drama that he described. He had hoped for a response, perhaps for a place among important thinkers. What he received at first was silence. A less generous storyteller might linger over his resentment, but silence can also be a setting for work. A book exists even when few people read it. A thought can wait. The history of philosophy is full of ideas that traveled slowly because the world was busy listening to something else. In the years around the book's publication, Schopenhauer spent time in Weimar, a city associated with literature, music, and the lingering prestige of Goethe. His mother kept a salon there, gathering writers and artists. Johanna Schopenhauer was socially gifted in a way her son was not. She could make a room move. Arthur, by contrast, often seemed to prefer the hard edge of an argument to the fluid compromises of sociability. Goethe interested him deeply. The older writer was not only a poet, but a figure of wide curiosity, attentive to color, plants, art, and the forms of nature. Schopenhauer worked with Goethe on questions of color theory and admired his capacity for observation. They shared in different ways a suspicion that dry abstraction can miss the living presence of things. Imagine a conversation in a lamplit room, an older, celebrated writer, a younger philosopher full of conviction, colored papers or glass set near the window. The attempt to understand how light and the eye make a world of color. It is a scene of thought becoming visible. Philosophy is sometimes mistaken for a life lived entirely away from the senses. Yet Schopenhauer's central idea begins with experience, as it is lived, seen, and felt. Color is not merely out there, waiting in a neutral world. It belongs to an encounter between light, eye, and mind. This does not mean the world is a private fantasy. If several people look at a sunset, they can point to the same horizon. They can agree that the clouds are moving and the light is fading. Representation is not isolation. It is the shared world of experience, structured enough that people can speak, act, and correct one another. But it is never simply a view from nowhere. It is always a world appearing within conditions of life. That phrase, a view from nowhere, may itself help us settle. Much anxiety asks us to judge ourselves from an impossible vantage point, as though we should be able to see our whole lives with absolute objectivity and produce a final verdict. Schopenhauer's philosophy refuses that fantasy. We are in the world. We do not stand outside it with a complete map. We see from a body, from a time, from a history, from a present state of attention. The body is not an inconvenience added to a pure mind. It is the place from which the world is given, and the place in which will becomes unmistakable. A headache makes a theory of embodiment unnecessary. Hunger makes the body impossible to ignore. So does delight, exhaustion, an unexpected burst of energy, the relaxation that follows safety. The body is not merely a thing we own. It is the lived condition of every owning, choosing, and thinking. Schopenhauer's language can sound as though will is always violent. Drive, struggle, conquest, hunger. But will has quieter forms too. The wish for a room to remain peaceful. The wish to sleep. The wish to stop performing for a while. The wish to hear a piece of music through to its end. Even these are movements of life reaching toward a condition. They are not bad because they are desires. They simply remind us that the self is not a fixed possession. It is always in some relation to what it has and what it lacks. At night, this can be observed without alarm. A desire appears. It may say, I need to solve this now. I need to remember that. I need to make tomorrow certain. Schopenhauer would not ask you to win an argument with the desire. He might ask you to notice its form. Here is striving making its claim. Here is the will turning toward an object. It is real, but it is not the whole room. The fire continues beside it. The breath continues beneath it. Attention can widen enough to include the desire without handing it the keys. This is not yet the denial of the will, the austere phrase for which Schopenhauer later became known. It is only a beginning. The possibility of becoming a spectator of one's own movement. There is a difference between being carried entirely by an impulse and noticing that an impulse has arrived. That difference may be no larger than a breath, but a breath can make space. The major work kept unfolding through this distinction. The world as representation tells us about the form of experience. The world as will tells us about its pressure. One side shows a world of objects, causes, distances, and appearances. The other shows a world of need, momentum, and unquiet life. Schopenhauer believed neither side could be discarded. To see only objects is to forget that we live from within. To see only inward desire is to forget the shared world that holds and limits us. It is an object. Wood, heat, light, sound, a physical process. And it is also part of a lived scene. Warmth desired, darkness held at a distance. A rhythm that allows the body to soften. The same thing can appear under different descriptions without becoming two different things. Perhaps this is why the image can stay with us. The world is not divided cleanly into cold matter on one side and private feeling on the other. The lived world is already an intertwining of both. As we move deeper into Schopenhauer's account of desire, it may help to keep that fire in mind. It does not ask to be a metaphor. It is only a fire. And yet the mind uses it naturally. A small active center, always consuming something, always changing, never quite fixed. By the time the coals grow quiet, we may have understood why Schopenhauer thought the usual business of wanting could not be our final home. Schopenhauer's most quoted observation about happiness is also one of his most misunderstood. Human life, he says in various ways, moves like a pendulum between suffering and boredom. When we lack what we desire, we suffer the lack. When the desire is satisfied, its urgency fades and an emptiness or new desire can take its place. It is a hard picture. It can sound as though no pleasure is genuine, no achievement worth having, and no ordinary contentment possible. That is too crude. A meal when one is hungry is genuinely good. Friendship, relief, learning, laughter, a warm room after cold weather, these are not illusions. Schopenhauer is trying to describe their instability, not deny their reality. The pleasant state does not generally sit still and declare itself complete. It becomes normal. A fresh want appears at the edge of the mind, often before we have noticed that the earlier one was met. Consider a small example. You are waiting for an email or a message. The waiting adds a restless charge to the hour. At last, it arrives. There may be relief, perhaps pleasure. Then almost immediately the mind begins reading between lines, wondering what comes next, or turning to something else that needs attention. The object of desire did not fail to arrive. It simply could not do the larger job that desire had quietly assigned to it, making the self permanently secure. Schopenhauer thinks we make this assignment again and again. A new job, a new house, a new relationship, a public success, a finished project, a better version of the body, a settled plan for the future. Any of these may matter deeply, none need be mocked. But the will uses them as stations on a journey that has no obvious terminus. It says, perhaps not in words, that after this one thing, the pressure will finally ease. Then the thing arrives, and the pressure changes shape. There is wisdom in noticing this before the mind becomes cynical. Cynicism says that nothing is worth wanting. Schopenhauer's deeper lesson, at least as we can use it, is gentler. Do not ask a finite thing to give infinite rest. Let it be what it is. Let the meal satisfy hunger. Let the conversation be a conversation. Let the finished work be finished work. Do not make each of them carry the impossible task of completing the self once and for all. This is why the word boredom matters. It is not merely the complaint of someone with an empty afternoon. For Schopenhauer, boredom exposes what happens when a particular desire has fallen silent, and no new one has yet taken command. The world can feel flat. Time grows heavy. The self looks around for something to fasten onto. Boredom reveals that the will does not simply seek objects, it seeks the movement of seeking. We can recognize this without condemnation. A person may reach for a screen, open a cupboard, start a conversation, browse, plan, rearrange, check again. None of these acts is dramatic, yet they can be little answers to the question, what should I do with the space that is opened around me? The will often finds stillness uncomfortable because stillness removes the next object that would give it direction. Sleep is an interesting exception. We do not usually think of sleep as an achievement. It is almost the opposite. It arrives most easily when effort withdraws. You cannot force it in the same way you can force a door or finish a task. The more aggressively one pursues sleep, the more alert the mind can become. Schopenhauer might have recognized the paradox. The will tries to will its own quiet, then discovers that the effort is part of the noise. So tonight there is no need to make sleep another item on the list. It may come, or it may take its time. The philosophical story can simply offer the mind a slower object of attention. If a desire is present, it is allowed to be present. If there is boredom, it too can be observed. Neither needs to become an enemy. Schopenhauer's account of striving reaches beyond human restlessness. He sees a kind of competition built into the natural world. Organisms require food, space, protection, and time. The hawk needs what the smaller animal cannot give without losing its life. The forest grows through pressure, shade, decay, and replacement. A flourishing form can become the condition of another form's disappearance. Modern biology describes these matters with more precision than Schopenhauer could have possessed. His metaphysical language should not be mistaken for science. But he was sensitive to something ordinary observation can confirm. Nature is not arranged chiefly for comfort. It is beautiful, intricate, and often astonishing. It is also indifferent to our wish that things be gentle. The same sea that carries ships can break them. The same body that permits joy will eventually grow tired. This makes Schopenhauer sound like an enemy of consolation. Yet he is really an enemy of a certain kind of false consolation. The promise that the world is secretly designed to make every individual wish come out well. He doubts that story. In its place, he asks whether clarity itself might be a form of mercy. If life contains loss and frustration by its nature, then perhaps we can stop being continually surprised that it does. There is a difference between despair and relinquishment. Despair says that nothing can be borne. Relinquishment says that some demands may be put down. The difference is quiet but important. A person who no longer expects every desire to be fulfilled may still care, work, love, create, and protect. They may simply stop treating the world as a machine that owes them final happiness. Schopenhauer sometimes reaches for sources beyond the European canon to describe this release. He read translations of Indian religious and philosophical texts, including the Upanishads, and found in them a language of illusion, unity, and release that resonated with his own ideas. We should not turn this into a story that he somehow possessed or summarized traditions far more ancient and varied than himself. His understanding was limited by the translations and the period in which he read. Still, the encounter mattered to him. He was drawn especially to the thought that the everyday self, with its urgent boundaries and claims, may not be the deepest truth. This did not lead him to a cheerful optimism about cosmic harmony. His temperament remained severe. But it helped him imagine that the isolation of the wanting individual might not be the final word. To understand why, we need another of his difficult phrases, the principle of individuation. This refers roughly to the way the world of representation divides into distinct things in space and time. Here is this body, there is that body. Here is this moment, there is another moment. Here is my hunger, there is your hunger. These distinctions are real within experience and necessary for ordinary life. Without them, no one could find a home, keep an appointment, or know where to place a cup. But Schopenhauer wonders whether these distinctions are the deepest level of reality. If the same will is expressing itself through all living beings, then the separateness of individuals may conceal a deeper kinship. This thought will become central to his account of compassion. Before we reach that, it helps to see its emotional force. When another person suffers, we do not merely observe an object in space undergoing a change. Sometimes, despite every difference of history and circumstance, we recognize suffering from within. That recognition can be immediate. A child cries. An older person loses balance on a pavement. We do not need a theory of the will to feel the small inward wince. Something in us answers. Schopenhauer takes that response seriously. He thinks compassion is not a polite addition to an otherwise selfish world. It is evidence that the hard boundary between self and other can become, for a moment, transparent. We will return to compassion later. For now, remain with the more private question of wanting. If the will makes life restless, must rest mean the total extinction of will? Schopenhauer sometimes speaks that way. And it is one reason his philosophy has a cold reputation. But his life and his writing also dwell on less total moments. Art, contemplation, music, the recognition of beauty. These do not abolish desire forever. They interrupt it. An interruption can matter. Imagine walking through a city while preoccupied with an errand. The streets exist only as obstacles or routes. Then perhaps you see light across a building, hear a musician through an open window, or notice a tree moving above a wall. For a few seconds, the errand loses its monopoly. You are not calculating what the sight can do for you. You are simply there with it. The mind has stopped asking, what next? Schopenhauer calls this aesthetic contemplation. It is not the same as liking something because it belongs to you, flatters you, or serves a plan. It is a way of attending in which the object is allowed to appear without being immediately recruited into the economy of desire. The self becomes, in his phrase, a pure subject of knowing. The phrase is grander than the experience needs to be. In ordinary language, for a while, you are simply looking. Looking in this way can happen before a painting. It can happen before a face at rest, a bowl on a table, a coast in low light, a piece of architecture, a bird crossing an empty sky. It can happen while reading a poem, if the poem catches attention without demanding a practical result. The object need not be spectacular. Its importance lies in the temporary suspension of the question, how can this serve me? This is a very different use of the mind from worry. Worry tends to place the self at the center of every scene. What could happen to me? What should I do? What have I missed? Aesthetic attention loosens that center. The self does not disappear, but it becomes less like a manager standing at a desk, and more like a listener in a darkened hall. For a sleek story, it is a beautiful thought. You do not need to achieve a special state. You can let the fire be the object for a while. Not fire as a source of heat you must manage, or an image you must interpret, but fire as a changing form. A flame rises, folds, thins, begins again. The eye follows it without needing to conclude anything. In that small release from usefulness, Schopenhauer finds a pause in the will. The pause is temporary. He does not pretend otherwise. After the painting, the walk, the music, the hunger returns. The work waits. The body has needs. But a temporary freedom is not negligible because it ends. A rest between waves is still rest. A clear patch of sky is still sky. The mind need not live permanently outside desire to know that desire is not the only possible mode of attention. This is where Schopenhauer begins to become less a philosopher of gloom and more a philosopher of intervals. He notices the places where the usual pressure weakens. They are often modest places, a landscape viewed without a plan, a quiet piece of music, a moment of pity for someone else, a thought that does not immediately return to its owner. These do not make the world harmless. They make it for a while less tightly held. In Dresden, where he worked on his major book, the ordinary conditions of a life continued around the large architecture of the system. Rooms had to be rented. Meals had to be found. Letters arrived. A city made its weather. The philosopher who wrote about the world as will was still one body among bodies, subject to time and circumstance. This is not an embarrassment to the philosophy. It is its condition. No one writes a theory of desire from a place beyond desire. Perhaps that is why we can listen without placing him on a pedestal. Arthur Schopenhauer is not required to be a perfect guide. He is a difficult companion who saw one side of life with unusual clarity. He saw that wanting can make us feel driven, even when nothing is visibly chasing us. He saw that satisfaction is fragile. and he saw that attention, at its best, can sometimes become less possessive. The fire has settled a little lower now. The world outside the imagined room is still there, with all its demands and possibilities. But nothing needs to be answered immediately. For the next part of the night, we can enter the rooms of art more fully. Painting, poetry, tragedy, and the strange privilege Schopenhauer gives to music. They will not rescue us from life. They will show us how life can be listened to without always being grasped. Schopenhauer's account of art begins with an unusual ambition. He does not think art is merely decoration for a life whose real business happens elsewhere. Nor does he think it is chiefly a way of recording private feelings. Art can do both of those things, of course. A painting can decorate a room, a poem can give form to a particular grief. But Schopenhauer thinks art is capable of something more fundamental. It can lift the mind, briefly, out of its usual enslavement to practical interest. Most of the day, objects arrive already marked by use. A chair is for sitting, a key is for opening, a phone is for answering. A face may be a face from which we want approval, assistance, affection, or forgiveness. The practical world is not false. It is necessary. We need to recognize tools, dangers, duties, and opportunities. Yet a mind that sees only use becomes tired in a particular way. It makes every object answer the question, what can I do with this? Art interrupts the question. Before a painting, a viewer may spend time with a face that cannot answer back, a storm that cannot wet them, a distant room that cannot be entered. The scene becomes available for contemplation. The eye can stay, the mind can notice color, proportion, shadow, gesture, and form, without having to turn them into a task. The object is no longer merely a means within a chain of purposes. Schopenhauer borrows from Plato the thought that art can reveal enduring forms or patterns beneath the scramble of individual things. He calls them ideas, with a capital letter, in the older philosophical sense. This is not the same as an idea in someone's head, like an opinion about where to go for dinner. It is closer to a stable pattern, the human face, the movement of water, the gravity of a ruined building, the character of a tree, the force of a storm. A good painter does not simply copy every accidental mark in front of the eye. The painter selects and arranges, allowing something more general to appear through the particular. A portrait may be one person and also a study of attentiveness, pride, fatigue, innocence, or age. A landscape may depict one valley, while also giving the mind a sense of distance, stillness, and the slow weight of earth. You do not need to accept Plato's metaphysics to recognize the experience. A photograph of a stranger can sometimes seem more than a record of one afternoon. It gathers a human expression into a form we understand without knowing the person. A painting of a bowl can hold the quietness of domestic life. A piece of music can seem to say something no particular sentence could say. Art makes the ordinary more available to attention. For Schopenhauer, this availability is a kind of relief. The individual self, with its private anxieties and desires, does not vanish. But for a time it stops insisting that everything refer back to its own needs. You become a spectator. The word can sound passive, yet it names an active and delicate capacity to receive something without immediately trying to own it. There is a difference between looking at a garden because you are deciding whether it needs work and looking at the same garden as evening arrives. In the first case, the mind counts, plans, notices deficiencies. In the second, the mind may notice the relation of dark leaves to pale sky, the way a path recedes, the fact that the whole small scene has become quietly complete without asking anything of you. Both ways of looking are legitimate. Schopenhauer cares about the second because it reveals an alternative to constant striving. The philosopher is not asking us to become useless. He knows that life requires action. The point is that action need not consume every mode of consciousness. There can be intervals in which the will takes a seat and attention is allowed to wander without aim. A person who has such intervals may return to practical life with more gentleness, not less. Poetry occupies an important place in this picture because poetry can show not only outward forms but the inner drama of human life. A poet can make longing, jealousy, courage, folly, vanity, and tenderness visible without writing a psychological report. Characters move through situations, make choices, misunderstand one another, lose what they thought they could keep. The reader watches, and for a while, understands the pattern without being trapped inside the immediate pressure of their own particular case. This is part of the strange comfort of tragedy. Why would anyone choose to watch a story of loss, betrayal, suffering, or death? Schopenhauer thinks tragedy is the highest form of poetry because it shows the collision built into the world of will. Good people can be hurt. Desires can conflict without a villain being wholly responsible. Circumstance can make suffering unavoidable. The world is not a simple moral machine in which virtue receives a prize before the curtain falls. That sounds severe, but tragedy can also be clarifying. It takes private misery out of its narrow room. The spectator is not asked to enjoy suffering. They are asked to see that suffering is not always a personal mistake. The recognition can bring sorrow, but also a strange loosening of the will's demand that reality be different at once. In the theater, if the work is powerful, the audience may sit in silence after a scene ends. No one has solved the problem. Yet the silence is not empty. It is a shared attention to something that cannot be turned quickly into use. The mind has been moved out of its own small circuit. Schopenhauer calls this knowledge, but it is not knowledge like a list of facts. It is the knowledge of seeing. We may encounter a smaller version of it in a novel read before sleep. The day has been full of one's own name, one's own obligations, one's own unfinished concerns. Then a page opens onto another life. A person in another century walks through another city, makes a decision, waits for a letter, looks at rain on a window. The reader enters and is briefly relieved of being the sole center of the world. This is not escape in a cheap sense. It can be a practice in leaving the self alone for a while. Schopenhauer's own life was not always generous enough to embody this lesson. He could be quarrelsome, vain, and harsh. He had long conflicts, including a serious dispute with a neighbor after an incident in which he pushed her. It would be dishonest to turn him into a sage of universal sweetness. Philosophy does not erase character. A person can see a truth and still fail to live it. That failure does not make the truth worthless. It makes it human. We do not need to imitate Schopenhauer in order to learn from his account of attention. Indeed, one of the quiet pleasures of philosophy is that ideas often outgrow their authors. A philosopher gives us a lens, and we may use it more kindly than they sometimes used it themselves. Music, for Schopenhauer, goes further than the other arts. He gives it a special place because he thinks music does not merely represent the visible forms of the world. It speaks more directly to the movement beneath them. A painting may show a human being, an animal, or a landscape. Music does not need to show anything. It unfolds in time as tension, release, repetition, acceleration, suspension, and return. That structure resembles the life of the will. A melody reaches outward, pauses on an unresolved note, moves through difficulty, comes home, or fails to come home. A rhythm gathers energy, then lets it fall away. We do not need words to feel anticipation or fulfillment in the movement of sound. Schopenhauer believes this is because music does not copy the appearances of desire. It expresses the inner rhythm of desire itself. Again, this is a metaphysical claim, not a fact a laboratory could simply confirm, but it gives language to a familiar experience. A piece of music can seem to understand a feeling before we have found words for it. It may not tell us what happened or who is responsible. It simply moves in a shape that the body recognizes. Something rises, something waits, something resolves, or remains suspended. For a man who thought life was made of striving, music offered a remarkable paradox. It gives form to striving, but it can also release us from it. The listener follows the movement, without needing to achieve its conclusion. A melody can desire on our behalf. A chord can hold tension without forcing us to do anything about it. We become listeners to the will rather than servants of it. Perhaps this is why music can be so useful near sleep, provided it is gentle enough not to demand attention. It gives the mind a structure that is neither argument nor task. One does not have to work through a melody. It carries its own time. The listener is allowed to be carried, then gradually allowed to let go. Schopenhauer played the flute and is often remembered walking in Frankfurt with his poodle, carrying the air of a solitary man who valued routine. It is easy to turn such details into caricature. The grumpy philosopher, the dog, the flute, the fixed habits. But a routine can also be a small architecture of peace. A person who has found a rhythm of reading, walking, eating, and playing music may be making room for thought without announcing it. We should be cautious about romanticizing solitude. Solitude can nourish. It can also harden. The difference often lies in whether it opens the mind to the world or becomes a way of refusing it. Schopenhauer's best writing about art opens outward. It asks the self to stop demanding that every encounter confirm its own importance. This is why art belongs naturally beside compassion in his philosophy. Both loosen the strict boundary of self-interest. In art, one attends to an object without using it. In compassion, one encounters another being's pain, without reducing it to a calculation of personal gain. Both are forms of seeing beyond the immediate claim of the individual will. There are objections, of course. Some might say that art is not always disinterested. People make art for money, status, politics, love, revenge, or survival. Audiences use art to signal taste or belong to a group. Schopenhauer would not need to deny any of this. His claim is about a possibility within the encounter, not a permanent social purity. Even in a commercial world, a painting or song may suddenly release the mind from its usual grip. Others may say that desire itself can be creative. A person writes a poem because they long to say something, builds a house because they want shelter, starts a movement because they cannot bear injustice. This too is true. The will is not simply an enemy. Without impulse, little would begin. Schopenhauer's insight is more selective. Desire becomes painful when it claims total rule. The capacity to step aside from it is not a rejection of life, but a way of making life more spacious. Imagine an empty museum gallery near closing time. The rooms are quiet. Light rests on the frames. You stand before a painting without reading the label. No one asks you to form an opinion. For a few moments, you do not have to improve, compare, justify, or decide. The painting does not solve anything. It makes a different use of time possible. Or imagine a piece of music heard from another room. You are not trying to identify it. You are not judging whether it is useful. The notes arrive and recede. They do not demand that you become someone else. Schopenhauer might say that the will has been quieted. We might say simply that the mind has stopped clenching around its next object. The distinction matters because we can practice it in small ways, not as a discipline to be perfected, which would become another demand, but as an invitation. Look at something for a few seconds longer than usefulness requires. Listen to a sound without asking what it means. Let a page, a tree, a face, a fire, or a piece of music be present without being recruited into the day's business. The relief may be slight. Slight relief is still relief. Schopenhauer's aesthetics are not a program for permanent happiness. They are an account of reprieve. In a life governed by need, reprieve has dignity. The will does not disappear. It waits at the edge. But for a while, it does not have to speak first. When the work of art ends, practical life returns. The theater lights rise, the novel is closed, the last note fades. The person leaves the gallery and notices the weather, the train time, the messages waiting. Yet the return need not erase the interval. Something has been remembered. There are ways of being awake that do not consist entirely in pursuing an object. This is an important thought to carry into the next room of Schopenhauer's philosophy. Art temporarily loosens the self from its private demand. Compassion asks whether the self can be loosened in relation to another person's suffering. It is a harder test. A landscape does not argue with us. Another human being may need something, contradict us, frighten us, or make claims we would rather avoid. To see them clearly requires more than aesthetic calm. It requires an ethical imagination. The fire is still present, though perhaps now lower and more red than gold. It has no lesson to teach, but it gives the mind a small object of contemplation as we turn from beauty to sympathy, and from sympathy to the question of whether a life can become less tightly ruled by its own desires. Compassion, for Schopenhauer, is the foundation of morality. This is striking. After so much talk of self-interest, striving, and conflict, we might expect him to say that generosity is only disguised calculation. People do sometimes help others for approval, safety, reputation, or future advantage. He knows that. But he believes there is another possibility. A person sees another being in pain, and the pain matters before the arithmetic has been completed. The response may be small: a hand held out, a voice softened, a stranger allowed to go first. The decision not to add to someone else's burden. Yet in genuine compassion, the other person is no longer merely an object in the landscape of our own concerns. Their trouble enters the field of attention. We do not become them. Their history and pain remain theirs, but we cease for a moment to treat their suffering as something that has nothing to do with us. Schopenhauer gives this response a metaphysical meaning. The world of everyday experience divides people into separate individuals. This body and that body. This hunger and that hunger. This life and another life. These distinctions are real and necessary. Yet in compassion, he thinks, the hard wall between self and other becomes a little transparent. The same striving will that we know from within ourselves is expressed in another being. Other people are not background figures. They carry fears, memories, griefs, hopes, and bodily states that may be largely invisible. Compassion begins when that invisibility is not used as an excuse for indifference. It can be practical without becoming dramatic. Someone is slow because their body hurts. Someone is short-tempered because they have had bad news. Someone looks distracted because they are frightened. These possibilities do not excuse every act, but they give the mind a way to pause before turning another person into an enemy, a nuisance, or a simple story. Schopenhauer also wrote forcefully about animals. He rejected the habit of treating them as mere machines, as though their inability to speak our language made their suffering unreal. Fear, pain, attachment, and the drive to continue belong to their lives. The world as will is not exclusively human. A creature does not have to argue for its pain in order for pain to matter. Here his philosophy becomes warmly practical. The abstract claim that all life is striving could have remained a cold doctrine. Instead, it becomes a reason for refusing cruelty. The distance between a person and an animal is real. So is the shared capacity to suffer. Compassion does not erase difference. It asks us to see difference without turning it into permission to be careless. We should not make Schopenhauer into a moral saint. He could be harsh, vain, and prejudiced. Some things he wrote are difficult and offensive to read now. His philosophy does not excuse those failures. If anything, they remind us that an insight about compassion is not the same as a life consistently governed by it. Compassion has to be practiced again in the presence of irritation, fear, status, habit, and the ordinary wish to be left alone. This makes the idea more useful, not less. It is not a medal awarded to kind people. It is an effort of attention. A person can fail at it in the morning and find another chance in the afternoon. A person can be tired and still avoid adding sharpness to a difficult moment. A person can recognize that their own pain has made them narrow, then slowly widen again. For Schopenhauer, compassion also points toward a quieter way of living. He does not admire the fantasy that the individual self can finally defeat the world by becoming powerful, admired, comfortable, or secure enough. Every victory gives the will a new object. The wish to win becomes the wish to keep what has been won. The wish to be seen becomes the wish to be seen correctly. The wheel keeps turning. To live more peacefully, then, may involve less assertion and less appetite for domination. This is not passivity. Care for another person may require courage, skill, money, protest, or long patience. A quieter will can still act. It simply acts without treating every act as a performance of its own importance. There is an objection worth keeping close. If desire is always a problem, might we become detached in a way that abandons responsibility? Would we stop trying to repair injustice or build things that matter? Schopenhauer does not always answer this well. His suspicion of progress can make active hope seem naive. We do not need to inherit that limit. It is one thing to recognize that no promotion can make a person invulnerable. It is another to deny that work can support a household. It is one thing to see that status is unstable. It is another to be indifferent to injustice. Wisdom includes knowing which desires can be loosened and which commitments call for care. At night, this distinction can be easy on the mind. No grand decision is needed right now. The body may be tired. The nervous system may have carried too much. Compassion can include compassion toward this body, its tired eyes, its overworked attention, its wish to set down the day without having solved it. Schopenhauer's deepest phrase for release is the denial of the will. It can sound hostile to life. In his most austere passages, he imagines a condition in which the ceaseless push of desire loses its authority. He connects this to ascetic practices, simplicity, restraint, a turning away from vanity, luxury, sexual appetite, and the endless project of personal enlargement. We should approach the phrase gently. Asceticism has meant many things across religions and cultures. It can mean voluntary simplicity, disciplined attention, fasting, and the refusal to let appetite govern every decision. It can also become a damaging war against the body. Nothing in this quiet night asks for that war. The body needs food, warmth, care, pleasure, safety, and sleep. It is not an enemy to defeat. What may be useful is the question beneath the severe language. What happens when we do not obey every desire immediately? What happens when a wanting is allowed to exist without being treated as an order? Often, it changes. It rises, holds attention, perhaps makes a great deal of noise, and then falls. It was real. It was not sovereign. This is not suppression. Suppression often gives a thought another route back into the room. It is closer to non-participation in the demand. You can feel a wish for reassurance without sending the message at midnight. You can feel anger without building a whole identity around it. You can feel restlessness without opening 10 new doors in search of relief. The will is noticed, but it is not immediately crowned. There is dignity in that small pause. Not the dignity of complete control over emotion, which no one possesses, but the dignity of not being entirely owned by whatever has appeared in the mind. A person can be vulnerable and still have a little space around the vulnerability. Schopenhauer takes this idea to an extreme. He imagines the saint, the ascetic, or the radically compassionate person as someone in whom the will's private assertion has grown almost quiet. Such a person no longer expects possession, fame, pleasure, or victory to give final rest. Whether or not that condition is possible, the image has a nocturnal beauty. The house is quiet. The day no longer asks to be improved. The self does not have to become larger before it is allowed to be at peace. There is a practical version of this each night. Sleep is not a moral victory, but it involves a letting go. The body releases its grip on the day. The mind, if it is fortunate, stops rehearsing every role. The world continues without our supervision. In the morning, names and tasks return. For a while, though, the will is not asked to organize anything. Schopenhauer would probably resist making sleep into a grand salvation. He was too suspicious of easy consolation. Still, the analogy is gentle. To sleep is to permit the world not to be managed. To rest is to acknowledge that the self need not hold every thread. It is not death, escape, or a final answer. It is a nightly interval in which striving is allowed to soften. In 1831, Schopenhauer left Berlin during the cholera epidemic. 2 years later, he settled permanently in Frankfurt am Main. The city would become the setting for the long final chapter of his life. It was a commercial city of streets, bridges, shops, travelers, newspapers, and ordinary business. He did not withdraw to a mountain or monastery. His philosophy of quieting the will was lived amid the daily movement of a real city. Imagine him in the late afternoon, after a walk. The light lowers over the street. A poodle keeps close beside him. He carries the habits of a man who has spent years in the company of his own ideas. In his rooms are books, papers, perhaps the flute, and the particular order that makes solitary life inhabitable. There is no need to make the scene saintly. It is simply a life arranged around routine after many disappointments. Routine can be refuge or prison. In Schopenhauer's case, it seems to have been both a protection and a way of continuing his work. The world had not given him the recognition he wanted. He might have taken that as proof that the work was worthless. Instead, he kept writing, revising, reading, and waiting. This is a quiet form of courage. Not the courage of dramatic action, but the courage of returning to a page when the applause has not arrived. A painter continues to paint. A teacher prepares another class. A carer performs an unseen task. A person keeps learning a skill that no one else has noticed. The will for recognition may still ache, but the work continues. Schopenhauer published further books, including On the Will in Nature and Essays on Ethics. In 1851, he published Parerga and Parerli Pamena, a collection of essays and aphorisms whose title means roughly supplements and omissions. In these later writings, a wider public began to find him. His prose could be vivid, sharp, and more immediately accessible than the immense structure of his major work. There is a gentle irony in late recognition. For years, Schopenhauer had wanted the world to notice him. Then, slowly, it did. Readers found the directness of his descriptions of desire and disappointment, and the unusual mixture of metaphysics with worldly observation. By the late 1850s, his reputation had grown considerably. Would this have made him happy? It surely gratified him. He was not above that. But his own philosophy cautions us against imagining a final conversion of the soul. Recognition is a real satisfaction, and it is also subject to the old movement of the will. What is achieved becomes normal. The mind that wanted one audience may now want a larger one, a safer place in history, a more devoted reply. This is not a reason to despise success. It is a reason not to ask success to carry the whole burden of a life. Schopenhauer's late fame is moving precisely because it arrived after delay. We can be glad for him without pretending it answered every question. A life is not justified by applause, nor invalidated by silence. As he grew older, the future could no longer appear as an endless field of possibility. Age changes the body, alters ambitions, and gives time a different weight. For some, this brings bitterness. For others, it makes room for a reduction of unnecessary striving. A familiar street, a walk, a book, the changing weather. These may become more visible when the urgent future loses some of its brightness. We can borrow a little of that perspective without waiting for age. Not every possibility must be pursued. Not every thought needs completion tonight. The future can remain future. The room is enough. The body is here. The fire is here. There is a story moving slowly through the dark, and no further achievement is required in order to listen. There is a temptation, when thinking about a philosopher's old age, to make the scene too tidy. We imagine that the years have delivered a final serenity, that the difficult man has become a clear-eyed sage, that the work and the life have at last come into agreement. Real lives are rarely arranged so well. Schopenhauer remained recognizably himself, proud, observant, opinionated, fond of routine, capable of sour judgment, and genuine tenderness. The late success did not remove the person who had wanted it for so long. Perhaps it is more interesting that way. A philosophy is not useful because it turns its author into a flawless example. It is useful when it gives other people a way to see more clearly. Schopenhauer's life is not a command to become solitary or severe. It is a reminder that insight and temperament do not always keep the same pace. We can understand a pattern in ourselves and still be caught by it. We can know that comparison exhausts us and still compare. We can know that attention is precious and still spend it badly. The knowledge may not cure the habit, but it changes the way the habit is seen. This is one reason the phrase world as representation is worth returning to. It does not mean that the world is unreal, or that we can think our way out of its hard facts. It means that the world we live in is always a world appearing to a subject. It is shaped by space and time, by cause and effect, memory, language, habit, and mood. The same street can appear hostile after bad news and welcoming after a kind conversation. The street has not become imaginary. Experience has changed its arrangement. Schopenhauer asks us to notice this without slipping into the fantasy that we are masters of our experience. We cannot simply decide that pain is pleasant or that loss does not matter. The body has its own testimony. A wound hurts, a frightening event can leave a mark. Hunger and exhaustion narrow attention. But the mind is not merely a passive screen either. It selects, returns, imagines, anticipates, gives emphasis, and makes a world around what it has encountered. At night, this is easy to observe. A small sound in the house can become an event. The mind reaches toward it, supplies possible causes, imagines what might follow. In daylight, the same sound may barely register. Nothing dishonest has happened. The nervous system is simply working with a different field of light, fatigue, and expectation. To see this is not to dismiss the sound. It is to avoid making the first interpretation the whole truth. The world as representation gives a name to that distance. There is the sound, and there is the story the mind makes around the sound. There is a message, and there is the atmosphere of possible meanings that gathers around the message. There is a thought about tomorrow, and there is the whole imagined future that seems to arrive with it. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing we can do is notice the difference between the small object and the large world of pressure we have built around it. This is not an invitation to distrust all thought. It is an invitation to think with a little more lightness. A representation is something presented. It can be examined. It can be held near or allowed to pass. The mind need not crawl inside every image it produces. It may sit beside the image, as one might sit beside a fire, aware of warmth and movement without needing to enter the flame. Schopenhauer's theory of the will supplies the other half of this observation. If representation tells us about the world as it appears, will tells us about the pressure inside appearing. The reaching, resisting, clinging, fleeing, wanting, and trying to continue. It is there in the sharp desire to change an uncomfortable moment. It is there in the quieter wish for tomorrow to go well. It is there in the body's unasked-for work of healing, digesting, sleeping, and keeping itself alive. We can hear the word will and mistake it for strength of character. In daily speech, willpower means the capacity to make oneself do difficult things. For Schopenhauer, will is much more basic and much less heroic. It is not the general issuing orders to the troops. It is the whole movement of life before orders are formed. A seed turns toward light without composing a plan. A child cries before language can explain the need. A frightened person pulls away before deciding to do so. This is why, for him, reason is not the sovereign ruler of human life. Reason can calculate, compare, remember, and build systems. Yet, it often arrives after the deeper current has begun to move. People make reasons for desires they have already felt. They find noble words for ambitions that began in insecurity. They call a fear prudence, or a wish for admiration a commitment to excellence. Sometimes the reasons are true. Sometimes they are clothes placed over an impulse that would rather not be seen without them. Schopenhauer can be bracing on this point. He asks us not to flatter ourselves too quickly. The rational creature is also an animal with a body, a history, appetites, and vulnerabilities. Even our loftiest thoughts occur in a being who must sleep, eat, recover from illness, and eventually die. This is not an insult to reason. It is a way of returning reason to the life from which it grows. The return can make a person kinder. When we remember that people are not purely rational engines, we may become less surprised by their contradictions. Someone can believe a good principle and fail to follow it when tired. Someone can want to be generous and become defensive when afraid. Someone can know that a habit is unhelpful and still reach for it, because habits are not arguments waiting to be defeated. This does not remove responsibility. It gives responsibility a more realistic field. Rather than demanding that a person become a perfect ruler over every impulse, we can ask for small forms of awareness. Notice the moment before the reply becomes cruel. Notice the wish to win an argument at any cost. Notice the old hunger for praise. Notice the body becoming overstimulated. These are not trivial acts. They are points at which the world of will becomes visible to itself. Schopenhauer's own style can sometimes make this visibility sound like a sentence. If we see the will clearly, he suggests, we may become weary of it. There's truth in that. A person who sees the endless recycling of a particular compulsion may lose some of its glamour. But weariness is not the only possible response. We can also meet the will with curiosity. Here it is again, making its old offer. What does it promise? What does it fear? What would happen if it were not obeyed for 5 minutes? Curiosity softens the moral drama. It does not say that desire is wise or foolish before it has been understood. It allows the desire to reveal its shape. The wish to check a message may conceal loneliness. The wish to work without stopping may conceal fear of being ordinary. The wish to withdraw may conceal the need for safety. Once the shape is clearer, one may act differently, or one may simply rest from acting for a while. This is why Schopenhauer's philosophy is more suitable for a quiet night than its reputation suggests. He does not ask us to become optimistic. He asks us to stop being astonished that life contains pressure. He asks us to recognize that much suffering comes from the will's refusal to let the present be limited. It wants a guarantee, a permanent possession, a victory that cannot be taken away. The world does not often provide such things. But the absence of a guarantee does not make the present empty. A limited good can still be good. A brief friendship, a safe room, a finished piece of work, a meal shared with someone, a few minutes under trees, the sound of rain, none need be made permanent in order to be real. The will's mistake is not that it loves these things, it is that it tries to hold them still. Let us imagine a cup of tea on a cold evening. It is warm, fragrant, held in 2 hands. Its goodness is entirely dependent on its finitude. It cools, it is drunk. The moment passes. If it could never end, it would cease to be the small comfort it is. Much of life has this shape. Its beauty does not survive by being made infinite. It survives by being allowed to be temporary without becoming nothing. Schopenhauer does not always speak this gently. He often sees transience as an accusation against the world. We can take a different lesson from the same fact. The temporary asks for attention, not possession. We may not be able to keep a moment, but we can inhabit it more fully while it is here. Art teaches this. A melody cannot be held in one place. If it stopped on the first note, it would not be music. It exists by passing. Each phrase leaves room for the next. The listener receives it not by grasping it, but by letting it go as it goes. A person who tries to possess every note loses the song. This is why music had such importance for Schopenhauer. He believed it did not simply represent an object in the world. A painting may show a landscape, a poem may tell a story, a sculpture may hold a body in stillness. Music moves at a more inward level. It gives the listener tension and release, insistence and rest, recurrence and transformation. It seems to speak the grammar of striving without needing a visible character to strive. The claim is philosophical and perhaps extravagant. A slow piece of music may contain longing without asking us to name what is longed for. It may hold grief without attaching the grief to one event. It may build expectation, delay it, and finally give a resolution that the body feels before the mind has supplied a sentence. For Schopenhauer, this was not merely an analogy. He thought music expressed the will itself more directly than the other arts. The melody moves like a line of desire through changing circumstances. The lower voices and harmonies support, resist, or hold it. A resolution is not the end of all movement. It is a local arrival, after which music may begin another journey. There is something almost merciful in this. The listener does not have to carry the desire personally. Music carries it. It makes a form out of tension, then permits the form to dissolve. One can hear a feeling without being required to do anything about it. The will is present, but it has become sound, and sound is allowed to pass through the room. Perhaps the crackle of a fire does a smaller version of this. It has no melody, but it has texture and change. A log shifts. A small spark rises and disappears. The sound returns without repeating exactly. The mind can rest on it because it does not ask to be interpreted. It offers movement without a demand for action. In the final years in Frankfurt, Schopenhauer had the outward conditions for such listening. His books, his walks, the city, the companionable routines of a life becoming smaller in its ambitions, and perhaps larger in its attention. We should not assume too much about his private peace. But the image of the older philosopher with a flute is useful. It suggests that even a mind preoccupied with suffering can make space for form, sound, and the daily work of being alive. The flute is a modest instrument for a philosophical image. It is not a trumpet announcing conquest. It requires breath, timing, and an ear for what comes next. The breath enters, becomes a tone, and is gone. A person cannot play every note at once. They have to stay with the line. So do we. The will may want to take the whole future into its hands. The body can only breathe this breath. We could make the same point about walking. A walk does not arrive all at once. One foot comes down, then another. The path is not conquered in a single act of will. It is passed through. A person walking beside a river, through city streets, or under bare winter branches may carry a large problem in the mind, but the body gives that problem a rhythm. Step, breath, sight, sound. The world becomes available in portions. Schopenhauer's philosophy can become healthier when we read it in this rhythm. Do not ask it for a total verdict on life. Let it offer a series of observations. We are beings who want. Wanting often hurts. Satisfaction is unstable. Art can give reprieve. Music can carry tension without making it a task. Compassion can make another's pain count. Simplicity can loosen the grip of endless acquisition. Sleep can remind us that the world does not require our constant management. Each observation is incomplete, and perhaps that is appropriate. A philosophy that promised complete rest might be another object for the will to pursue. We would turn it into a possession. The final answer, the perfect practice, the one system that makes everything settle. Schopenhauer's darker wisdom warns us against that too. The mind is very skilled at turning relief into a new demand. So let the ideas remain companions rather than commandments. The world as representation, a reminder that experience is shaped and can be inspected. The world as will, a reminder that the urge beneath thought is real and often older than reasons. Art, a reminder that attention can rest without owning. Music, a reminder that tension can move through time. Compassion, a reminder that the self is not the only center of reality. These are not pieces of furniture to arrange perfectly in the mind. They are lights seen through different windows. Some may be useful tonight, some may be useful months from now. Some may simply be heard as the voice grows softer and the fire keeps making its small changes in the dark. Schopenhauer died in Frankfurt in 1860 at the age of 72. His life did not end with a grand public conclusion. It ended, as lives do, with the body reaching its limit. The books remained. The opinions, the resentment, the insight, the routines, the late readers, all became part of history. The person who had tried to describe the will's restless movement was no longer there to want anything more. There is no need to make this thought heavy. Death is not a problem for tonight. It can remain at the far edge of the story, as it remains at the far edge of so many philosophies. Schopenhauer is interested in it because mortality reveals how little the individual will can finally secure. But mortality can also make the present gentler. It can make us less eager to waste attention on every small contest. It can remind us that the time we have is not improved by being fought with continuously. To remember a philosopher after his death is not to preserve him whole. We take what is living in the work and leave what cannot be carried forward. From Schopenhauer, we can take the seriousness with which he regards suffering, the refusal to pretend that desire automatically makes us happy, the high value he places on art and compassion, and the thought that a quieter life may be richer than a more victorious one. We can leave behind his unnecessary cruelties, his sweeping judgments, and the ways his pessimism sometimes closes possibilities that ought to remain open. A philosopher is not a room we must live in exactly as we find it. A philosopher is a house we may enter, look around, learn from, and leave with some windows opened. The fire has burned for a long time now. It is no longer necessary to follow the argument with the same attention. The ideas have made their path. They can begin to blur at the edges. Representation, will, desire, art, music, compassion. They need not be held tightly. They can become a slower rhythm of words, heard and then released. There is the world as it appears, the darkness of the room, the sound under the voice, the body lying where it lies, the faint sense of time moving on. There is the will, perhaps a small remaining wish for sleep, for safety, for tomorrow to be easier. Both can be present. Neither needs to be defeated. The mind may still think. It may make a plan, remember a phrase, drift toward a concern. This is not a failure of the night. It is simply the mind doing what minds do. A thought is a representation. A desire is a movement of will. Each can appear, and each can be allowed to pass without being made into the whole horizon. For now, there is nothing to acquire, nothing to prove, nothing to settle before the next breath. There is only the possibility of letting the self become less tightly clenched around the day. The philosopher has said what he can say. The fire continues in its own language. The body knows more about resting than the mind sometimes remembers. Before the night grows quieter still, there is one more question that often follows Schopenhauer's account of will. If we are moved by desires, needs, temperaments, and motives that do not begin in conscious choice, what becomes of freedom? Are we simply carried along by forces we cannot command? Schopenhauer's answer is not designed to make us feel powerful. He distinguishes between the ability to do what one wills and the deeper question of whether one can will what one wills. A person may be free in ordinary circumstances to raise a hand, take a walk, accept an invitation, or refuse one. Yet the motives that make one action attractive and another difficult arise from character, experience, body, and situation. The self does not stand outside all of these and select its own nature as though choosing from a shelf. It is a sobering thought. We like to imagine that the true self is a small ruler somewhere inside, entirely separate from habit and history. But when we look closely, there are preferences that arrived early, fears learned before we understood them, rhythms of energy and exhaustion, attachments we did not choose, and capacities that depend on luck as much as effort. The person who decides is also the person who has been formed. This need not make responsibility meaningless. It may make it more humane. A person can still be held accountable for harms, still be asked to repair what they have done, still be expected to learn. but accountability becomes less like a demand that they should have been a different species of being. It becomes a way of working with the actual conditions of change: consequences, habits, relationships, support, reflection, time. Schopenhauer thinks character is remarkably stable. People reveal themselves, he believes, under changing circumstances, because the underlying will takes a particular form in each individual. Modern psychology and common experience both give us reasons to qualify this. People can change, sometimes profoundly. They can learn to interrupt old patterns, recover from injuries, become less afraid, or become more generous through practice. Yet change is rarely a simple decree. It needs conditions. This is another place where the philosopher's darkness can be made useful rather than final. We do not have to believe that character is fixed forever in order to admit that change is difficult. The will does not yield merely because it has been criticized. A person may understand exactly why a habit damages them and still need patience, structure, friendship, rest, and repeated attempts before the habit weakens. At night, none of this needs to become a project. You are not required to redesign your character before sleep. The thought can be much simpler. There are forces in you that did not begin as clear choices. You do not have to hate yourself for having them. You may notice them. You may make room around them. Tomorrow, in daylight, some small choice may become possible. Tonight, it is enough to stop demanding a perfect inner ruler. Schopenhauer himself was suspicious of the proud modern picture in which human beings stand at the center of a world arranged for their progress. He saw people as finite animals, clever but exposed, capable of thought but not lifted out of need. The more one tries to dominate nature completely, he suspected, the more one discovers new forms of dependence. Comfort produces new anxieties. Security produces new things to lose. Knowledge enlarges the field of what can go wrong. This is not a reason to reject science, medicine, or the practical arts. Those have relieved enormous suffering. It is a reminder that control has limits. We can repair much and still not abolish vulnerability. We can make a home warmer and still not ensure that every person in it will be happy. We can understand a disease and still have to wait through a difficult night. There is no shame in these limits. They are part of being alive. The will often turns limits into insults. It says, "This should not be happening to me. I should have been able to prevent it. The world must return what I have lost." Sometimes the protest is morally necessary. Injustice should be named. Preventable harm should be prevented. But sometimes the protest is directed at the ordinary structure of finitude itself. The fact that bodies tire, plans fail, people change, weather arrives, and nothing can be kept entirely safe. Schopenhauer's invitation is not to approve of suffering. It is to see the difference between an evil that can be resisted and a limit that must be lived through. Confusing the two spends a great deal of energy. When a limit cannot be removed, the will can either fight it without end or learn a different relation to it. The second response may still hurt. It is not resignation in the sense of giving up all care. It is the beginning of not wasting the whole self on an impossible demand. There is a quiet strength in this. A storm may keep a person indoors. A period of illness may close doors that were expected to stay open. A loss may make the future feel smaller. None of these needs to be celebrated. Yet a person may find that life continues in a different key. Attention becomes more local. The value of a conversation, a familiar view, a useful book, or a peaceful hour increases because the larger fantasies have been set down. Schopenhauer would say that the will has been humbled. We might say that the mind has become more available to what is actually here. Either way, the change is not necessarily a defeat. It can be a form of truthfulness, and truthfulness can sometimes be kinder than hope built on impossible terms. This brings us back to the word pessimism. It is often used as though it meant simply seeing the dark side of everything. Schopenhauer's pessimism is more specific. He believes that suffering is not an accident at the edges of life, but is bound up with desire itself. To desire is to lack. To satisfy a desire is to prepare for another. The world does not contain a stable arrangement in which every striving individual receives lasting fulfillment. There is force in this argument, but there are also questions. Does he give enough weight to forms of happiness that are not just satisfactions of lack? What about play, curiosity, friendship, shared work, humor, care for a child, the pleasure of understanding something difficult, the calm of a body at ease? These may not be permanent, but perhaps impermanence does not make them merely pauses between pains. We can let the question remain open. A philosopher becomes more useful when they are permitted to be challenged. Schopenhauer makes us wary of easy optimism. In return, we may ask him to be wary of easy despair. The world contains forms of suffering he saw clearly. It also contains forms of joy and mutuality that do not fit neatly into the image of the pendulum. Perhaps a more balanced nighttime thought is this: contentment is not a state we can possess forever, but it is not therefore unreal. It appears in intervals. It appears when the will is not demanding proof that the interval will last. A person may be content with a walk, a meal, a book, a room, a face, a psalm, or a quiet hour. The contentment does not promise to survive unchanged. It does not need to. It is true while it is true. This is close to Schopenhauer's appreciation of art, though gentler in tone. In contemplation, the self is relieved from its endless calculations. The object is not seized. The moment is not forced to justify the future. For a short time, the mind is not on the way to something else. It is where it is. One could call this presence, though the word can be used too easily. Presence is not a polished state in which no thought ever wanders. It may be as humble as noticing the texture of a blanket, the temperature of the air, the rhythm of a voice, the slight distance between one thought and the next. Presence does not erase pain. It prevents pain from borrowing every room in the house. Schopenhauer's early reading of Plato helped make him attentive to forms that outlast individual events. His reading of Kant helped make him attentive to the conditions of experience. His attention to the body helped make him suspicious of a purely intellectual account of human life. His encounter with Indian texts helped him imagine a loosening of individuality. His love of music and art gave him an experience of reprieve. These threads do not make a simple doctrine. They make a long attempt to understand why a living being might seek peace in a world that does not grant final security. The answer he offers is not in the end to win the world. It is to require less of victory. It is to see that our usual objects of desire cannot bear the weight we put on them. It is to allow art, compassion, simplicity, and contemplation to show that the will can become quieter without the world becoming perfect. There is modesty in that answer. It may be too modest for someone who wants a theory of progress, a plan for history, or a promise that suffering will be redeemed. Schopenhauer does not give those things. He gives something narrower, a way of understanding the pressure of wanting, and a few windows through which that pressure can ease. We have already looked through several of those windows. There was the body, which teaches us that thought does not float free of life. There was art, which allows attention to rest without taking possession. There was music, which gives the movement of desire a shape we can listen to. There was compassion, which interrupts the fantasy that only the self is real. There was sleep, which arrives most easily when management relaxes. There are others. Humor can be one. Schopenhauer is not usually read as a philosopher of laughter, but humor can puncture the will's solemnity. A person who can see the absurdity of a familiar worry has not necessarily solved it, but the worry may lose some of its authority. The self becomes less like a king at the center of a crisis, and more like a character in a large, strange play. Nature can be another. Not nature as a moral teacher, for Schopenhauer is clear enough about its indifference, but nature as a scale that interrupts self-absorption. A wide sky, water moving along a shore, wind in trees, the slow unfolding of daylight. These do not care about our private drama. That can feel cold. It can also feel relieving. The world is larger than the thought that has been repeating in the mind. Conversation can be another. A real conversation in which neither person is simply waiting to speak, loosens the will by making another center of experience present. It asks us to receive a life that is not our own. This is not exactly Schopenhauer's preferred image. He valued solitude more than sociability, but his own ethic of compassion gives us room to include it. The self becomes less tightly enclosed when it listens well. Even work, when it is not made into an idol, can become a window. There are times when making something, repairing something, cooking, gardening, writing, or caring for a task draws attention out of its own loops. The activity is not valuable because it produces status. It is valuable because the person is genuinely occupied by the thing itself. For a while, the will is not chasing a future self. It is participating in a present form. Schopenhauer might call such moments partial liberation. We need not make the name important. They are moments in which the question, "What will I get from this?" falls silent, and the activity itself becomes enough. The paradox is that these often feel more alive than the frantic pursuit of happiness. The will stops trying to obtain life and begins, briefly, to live it. This does not make desire our enemy. Desire brings people toward food, safety, love, knowledge, and creation. Without some form of wanting, the world would be still in a different and far less fertile sense. The question is not whether to erase desire. It is whether desire must rule every hour, speak in every silence, and define the worth of every moment. Schopenhauer says no. The no is severe, but it contains a gift. You may have a desire without being its servant. You may enjoy a thing without believing it will complete you. You may lose a thing without concluding that nothing remains. You may allow a thought to be a thought, a feeling to be a feeling, a person to be a person, and a night to be a night. The old philosopher's word for the source of our restlessness was will. We can hear it now without fear. The will is not a monster hiding behind the furniture. It is the movement to which we belong, the body seeking comfort, the mind seeking sense, the heart seeking connection, the living creature continuing its life. It becomes painful when it cannot stop demanding that one condition be finally secured. Tonight, no condition needs to be secured. You do not need to secure the whole future. You do not need to solve the self. The body may loosen a little against the bed. The thought may grow less sharp. The fire may become the only thing that seems to be happening, and even that may drift into the background. If you are still awake, there is no need to be disappointed. Wakefulness is not a failure of philosophy or of the body. It is simply a state. The will may try to turn it into a problem. I must sleep now. This must be fixed. Tomorrow is already ruined. You can notice that pressure without joining it. Sleep is more likely to come as a visitor than as a prize. Let the visitor take its time. Let the mind have fewer objects. Let the story become less like a series of claims and more like a slow path already walked. Danzig, Hamburg, Göttingen, Berlin, Dresden, Weimar, Frankfurt. The young man moving away from trade, the reader opening Kant, the writer composing a great book that few people read. The older man walking with his dog, playing flute, waiting as the world slowly learns his name. These are not merely locations in a biography. They are different rooms in the same question. What is a human being doing when they want? What happens when the world does not answer the wanting? Can the mind see without grasping? Can one person recognize another person as more than a means? Can beauty make a pause? Can music let tension move through us without being turned into a task? Schopenhauer's answer is never entirely cheerful. That is part of why his ideas remain interesting. He does not flatter the listener with easy promises. Yet the final effect need not be despair. There is a tenderness in taking suffering seriously. There is relief in admitting that no human being can turn existence into a permanent possession. There is kindness in allowing the will to soften, rather than constantly demanding that it win. The room has grown quieter. Imagine the fire now as a bed of coals, a deep red light below the ash, still warm, but no longer making much display. The day, which once seemed full of urgent edges, has moved farther away. Its details may return tomorrow. They can do so. For now, they are not required. There is only this representation: a room, a bed, a voice, a soft recurring sound, the darkness around the curtains. There is only this will, the gentle wish to rest, perhaps joined by the wiser willingness not to force rest. These two facts can sit together. The world appears. The body breathes. The will loosens its grip by 1 degree. 1 degree is enough. A small release is still a release. A pause in the demand for a final answer is still a pause. The philosopher can remain beside the fire with his questions. You do not have to keep answering them. They can grow soft now, like the last lines of a book read too late at night, when the meaning has already entered and the words are free to fade. There is another way to approach the same quietness. Imagine returning, not to an argument, but to a series of rooms. In the first room is the young Arthur in Danzig, near the Baltic, before philosophy has become his work. There are ships, ledgers, family expectations, and the practical noise of a merchant's world. Nothing in the room announces that he will one day write about the metaphysical character of desire. Yet the room already contains movement. Trade crossing water, people wanting safety, profit, news, arrival, and return. In the next room, a young man has turned toward books. The world of commerce has not disappeared, but it has ceased to define the whole horizon. There are pages of Plato and Kant. There are university streets, lectures, rival systems, the particular solitude of a person who suspects that familiar answers are not enough. The question begins to take shape. What do we know when we know the world? And what are we when we move within it? Then there is the room of representation. It is almost empty, because the idea is so basic. A subject sees an object. A person hears a sound. Space and time give experience its order. Causes connect events. The world does not arrive as an undifferentiated flood. It arrives as this and that, near and far, earlier and later. We live inside this arrangement so completely that we usually forget it is an arrangement at all. The philosopher asks us to notice it, not to become trapped in doubt, and not to deny the reality of the room, but to see that reality is always encountered. The moon may be there above the roof, but it is also the moon as seen from this window, at this hour, by this tired or wakeful mind. The fire may be burning, but it is also warmth, sound, image, and the condition around which attention has gathered. Experience is the only doorway through which the world can become real to us at all. In another room is the body. It does not argue. It sleeps, wakes, hungers, flinches, recovers, grows warm, grows cold, and eventually becomes tired. It is an object in the world, visible to others and available to science. Yet it is also the place from which all objects are known. When the hand moves, we do not only see movement, we know something of intending movement. When the body aches, we do not merely observe an event, we endure it. This double knowledge gives Schopenhauer his path to will. Beneath the visible body, he finds striving. Not a noble slogan about determination, but the deeper and less tidy current of life pressing toward continuation, relief, contact, food, safety, pleasure, avoidance, and rest. The will does not always speak in sentences. It can be felt as impatience, appetite, anxiety, attraction, or the small refusal to let a matter go. The will is not evil. It is close to life itself. A newborn reaching for warmth, a plant taking light, a tired person drinking water, an animal seeking shelter. None of these needs to be condemned. Schopenhauer's question is what happens when the will becomes endless in its claims. It wants not just food, but a condition in which hunger will never return. Not just affection, but a condition in which no love can ever be lost. Not just safety, but immunity from all change. It asks finite objects to produce infinite reassurance. No object can do that. This is the origin of the pendulum. Lack hurts. Temporary satisfaction grows ordinary. The will searches again. Yet the pendulum is not a command to despair. It is a description that can help a person stop blaming one particular object for failing to carry an impossible burden. The job, the achievement, the message, the person, the plan, None was ever capable of giving final rest. Their failure to do so is not necessarily a failure of them. There is gentleness in realizing this. One can enjoy a good thing without questioning whether it will last forever. One can receive a kindness without turning it into a contract against loneliness. One can finish a piece of work without demanding that the finished work settle the whole value of a life. The will relaxes when it no longer makes every small arrival stand for an ultimate arrival. Another room contains a painting. It may be a landscape, a face, a patch of light on a wall. For a time, there is no practical question attached to it. The mind sees without immediately using. It does not ask whether the landscape will advance a career, whether the face will approve, whether the light can be kept. It simply stays with the form. Schopenhauer calls this aesthetic contemplation. The phrase can be left in the room with the painting. What matters is the quiet experience itself. The self stops being a manager for a few moments. Attention becomes less hungry. It is not an achievement to own. It is a way of looking that sometimes arrives when we stop insisting on a result. Another room contains music. There may be no visible object at all, only notes moving through time. A phrase rises. It seems to need an answer. Another phrase gives one, or withholds it. The listener feels a shape of tension and release without needing to name its object. In music, Schopenhauer hears the inner life of the will made audible. Whether or not that is literally true, music shows something important. A feeling can move without being acted upon. It can become sound, rhythm, and form. The listener does not have to solve the longing in a melody. The melody will carry it until it changes. A sad phrase is not a problem. An unresolved chord is not a mistake. It can be held for a moment, then allowed to become what comes next. The next room contains another person. Not an ideal person, not a person who is easy to understand, but an ordinary other with a body, a history, and some pain that may not be visible. Compassion begins here. The boundary around the self does not vanish, but it grows less hard. The other person is not merely a rival for attention, resources, or praise. They are another place where the will can hurt. This recognition is one of the best answers to Schopenhauer's darkness. If life contains suffering, then the moral task is not to pretend suffering away. It is to avoid increasing it needlessly, and to respond when it is possible to respond. Compassion does not require a grand sacrifice in every hour. It may take the form of patience. It may be refusing an unkind word. It may be remembering that a person who seems difficult may be carrying a world we cannot see. The room after that is simpler. There is less furniture. This is the room of quieting, perhaps of the limited asceticism we can borrow without violence. A desire knocks. It says, "Answer me now." The person inside does not have to open the door immediately. The desire may grow loud, then become less loud. It has not been destroyed. It has simply not been given the whole house. This is not the same as refusing pleasure. It is the refusal to make pleasure a tyrant. It is not the same as refusing connection. It is the refusal to treat every moment alone as an emergency. It is not the same as giving up hope. It is the refusal to demand that hope prove itself by morning. A quieter life has room for enjoyment, but it does not continually ask enjoyment to certify its worth. And then there is Frankfurt. A city, a room, a walk, a dog, a flute, papers on a table, a man growing old. Philosophy becomes less like a youthful challenge and more like a daily climate. The late recognition comes, but not as a final thunderclap. Readers arrive. The work begins to travel. The person remains mortal, particular, imperfect, and ordinary in the ways that matter most. It is a useful ending for a philosophical life. Not a triumph in which every question closes, but a long continuation in which some questions have become companions. Schopenhauer cannot force the world to become satisfactory. He can only describe why satisfaction is difficult, and show the few places where the demand for it becomes less fierce. Those places are modest. A painting, a melody, a walk, a compassionate act. A moment in which desire is observed instead of obeyed. A room at night, in which the self does not need to establish its position in the world. They may seem too small to answer the scale of suffering, but human life is often lived at that scale. A small decrease in pressure can make a real difference. A few minutes of unforced attention can change the character of an evening. This is why the fire belongs beside Schopenhauer. It is not there as a symbol of drama or revelation. It is there because it is useful to contemplate. It has movement without intention. It changes without asking anything of us. It warms the room without needing to be possessed. The eye can rest on it, then close. The fire does not promise that the world is kind. It does not make absence, grief, uncertainty, or difficulty disappear. It offers something smaller, and for tonight, perhaps sufficient. A center of warmth around which nothing needs to be decided. The will can put down its pen. Representation can grow dim. The mind can stop trying to make a final account of the day. If a worry returns, it may be met in the same way. Here is a representation, an image of something that might happen, a sentence remembered, a question waiting for daylight. Here is will, the urge to settle it now, to obtain certainty, to make the future stop being open. Notice both. Then let the fire remain in the scene as well. Let the body remain in the scene. The worry is not the only object present. The more the mind repeats this, the less dramatic it needs to be. Not a ritual, not a command, not a performance of wisdom, simply a returning. Thought, desire, sound, breath, warmth, darkness. Each appears, none has to become the whole world. Schopenhauer might say that we are learning to see the will without serving it. We might say that we are allowing the nervous system a little less work. The words do not matter as much as the change in pressure. A tight thought becomes a little less tight. A demand becomes a little less urgent. A night becomes less like a courtroom, in which every problem must receive a verdict. No philosopher can make sleep happen. No voice can give a guarantee. But a story can offer the mind something gentler than its usual loops. It can move slowly enough that attention no longer has to keep watch. The names and arguments can become scenery. The world as representation can become the dark room. The world as will can become the small wish to rest. Art can become the shape of the flame. Music can become the rhythm of the words. Compassion can include the person listening. And the person listening does not have to do anything with this. There is no test at the end. There will be no question asking whether the doctrine was understood. Schopenhauer's books will remain on their shelves. The old debates will continue among people who enjoy them. You may let every last point become soft. Perhaps the final lesson is not a lesson at all. Perhaps it is the permission to be a finite being for a while, to have a body that gets tired, to have a mind that wants too much and sometimes knows it, to have desires that return, and also intervals in which they quiet, to be part of a world that cannot be controlled from within one small self. There is humility in that, but not humiliation. The self does not become worthless because it is not sovereign. It becomes more accurately placed. One being among beings. One life among lives. One listener in a room where the night has become deep enough that nothing needs to be proved. The philosopher's sternness can now become something gentler. Yes, the will is restless. Yes, satisfaction passes. Yes, the world has sorrow in it. And still, there are moments of beauty, understanding, kindness, and rest. They do not cancel the sorrow. They stand beside it. They are not smaller because they are temporary. They are temporary, and that is one of the reasons they can be seen. The next breath does not need to lead anywhere. It can be only the next breath. The next thought does not need to be completed. It can be only the next thought. The next sound from the fire does not need to mean anything. It can be only a small sound in the dark. Let the room become simpler now. The book is closed. The chair is empty. The fire has become low and steady. Outside, the night continues without asking your permission. Inside, the body can become heavier. If sleep comes, it may come without announcement, the way darkness gradually fills the corners of a room. And if sleep takes longer, the night can still be gentle. There is no need to make an enemy of the hour. The story has reached its quietest place. Arthur Schopenhauer has walked back into history, leaving behind his difficult thought that the will can be seen, that it need not own every moment, and that attention may find peace when it stops trying to possess the world. For now, nothing more is required. The fire is here, the darkness is here, the body is here. The will may be loosening, slowly, as the last words lose their edges and become part of the sound.